Yeah,
Sometimes people wait until everyone connects, so I don't know whether you want to start
yeah,
sharp.
I will actually. I will start it. I will introduce you to because it's
Okay,
gonna be
perfect.
like only us, and then there's YouTube, and we're gonna get questions from YouTube from the people, and then I read it to you. I'm sorry, it's a different kind style of.
Yeah,
It's gonna be on a monologue between you and me.
perfect.
Tá, eu tô olhando aqui, Rogério, mas eu não tô vendo o YouTube ainda, não apareceu. O trem do. Ah,
So
apareceu agora.
Everton, you
It's
are in
live.
charge,
Yeah,
and I
I am
follow
in
whatever
charge.
you say. Yeah.
So now it's working. Olá, pessoal. Boa tarde, boa noite. I will switch. Eu vou falar inglês, porque temos um convidado que de extrema importância para a demografia atual. Então, vou mudar aqui a apresentação. So, hello everyone. We are going to start our seminars, regular seminars from on behalf of our grad program in demography and the NEPO, the Nuclear of Research Center in Campinas. We are honored here to have the presence as a speaker, Tomás Sobotka, which I'm going to introduce him. I'm just going to say some words about what he's doing. And he's going to present something about fertility and COVID during the pandemic. So Tomás, he's a researcher at the VID, Vienna Institute of Demography. His research is focused on global low fertility and family changes, family policies, fertility data, and measurement, migration, population, family change in Europe, and assisted reproduction. He is also head, and he helped a lot actually, to launch and expand several data repositories, which I can mention here: the Human Fertility Database, Human Fertility Collection, and Cohort Fertility Education Database. So he is also keen on expanding demographic knowledge beyond the boundaries of the discipline. To that aim, he's also collaborate with many institutions, so United Nations Population Fund, also with us, with NEPO, and we did some collaborations as well. And he's also coordinating European demographic data sheet. In 2017, I also need to mention he was awarded with the Allianz European Demography Award. And in 2022, the Dirk van de K Award for Social Demography, which was given by the European Association for Population Studies. So without further ado, Tomás, I'll leave the floor to you to present your work to us. And once again, thank you to accept the invitation and participate with our online seminars. So it's up to you, Tomás.
Thank you very much, Everton, for your nice introduction. It's a pleasure for me to present at the Unicamp seminar, and I'm sorry I cannot be with you in person. It's a little bit far away for one seminar. Much of the things I will be presenting to you is actually also related to the Human Fertility Database Everton mentioned. So we have a part of the Human Fertility Database, which is called Short-Term Fertility Fluctuations Data. And much of the results I would be showing you, presenting about what happened during the COVID pandemic. You can access the data and you can access the numbers there and the documentation. So let me share my slides and start the presentation. So you should be able to see the slides in full screen mode now. The presentation will give you a brief picture of birth trends and fertility trends in higher income countries during the COVID-19 pandemic. But it also tells you the story of how we demographers thought and what expectations we had about fertility trends as the coronavirus pandemic was unfolding, and what were the actual trends later on during the pandemic, and once the pandemic was over, because interestingly enough, the trends often didn't follow our expectations. So that's also partly the story of how things evolved and what were the main surprises of that. I also have to say this is a collective work. There are quite a number of colleagues at the Vienna Institute of Demography and at the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research who have been collaborating together on this research during the last 2 to 3 years. Just recently, we have a paper on the topic out in Population and Development Review. You see a screenshot here. You see all the names of people, or maybe they are too small, but you could see all the names of colleagues and people involved in this paper. And a very special thanks from my side go to 3 colleagues, Krzysztof Zeman, Iva Jaselioniene, and Maria Winkler-Dvorak, who have been working hard with the data analyses and also in practical ways in trying to find the best methods to deal with these data during the last years. So this is definitely a collective work where also these people have been very intensively involved in the past years. Now, before I get you into the COVID period, let me show you a big picture of fertility trends in European regions and in the United States before the coronavirus pandemic started, because they show essentially several things. First, as you all know, fertility rates are never stable. So it's a normal thing that fertility is moving, going up and down. And interestingly enough, during the decade of 2010 to 2020, in most highly developed countries, especially in those which initially had higher fertility rates, the general trend was towards lower fertility rates. So especially countries which were on the higher end of the low fertility spectrum, think of the Nordic countries, think of the United States, you can think of France. These countries experienced declining fertility rates even after the economic recession around 2008, 2010 ended. Fertility rates continued going down most of the years. And this is most clearly visible in the slide, which shows you ranking of the higher fertility countries from the highest fertility rates. I mean, of the lower fertility countries, but from the higher fertility end in 2008, and then shows you the total fertility rates in these countries, how it moved from 2008 to 2020. And you see some substantial drops. You see fertility falling in all of them. But you see some really substantial drops, for instance, in Norway or in Finland, where the total fertility rate went from 1.85 to 1.37 in that period. So when thinking about what happened during the coronavirus pandemic, it's also important to think what happened before and what would be the expectations based on the trends before the pandemic, which you can make 2 different expectations. One is that fertility in some countries declined so much that you would expect that at some point it has to go to reverse and start recuperating. But you could also make a conventional expectation that the trends observed before the pandemic would just continue in the future. So for many countries, you could expect that fertility rates and numbers of births would actually decline during the COVID period. What's also important is to think more theoretically about what could be expected during the health shocks such as the COVID pandemic. Our demographic evidence based on the periods of economic shocks and recessions, but also health emergencies and major pandemic in the past, such as the Spanish flu, suggests that people typically postpone or reduce childbearing during the times of major crises and uncertainty, including the health pandemics or epidemics. The same more or less happens with large seasonal flu outbreaks, although everything is condensed into a short period of time. You could think of a couple of months in winter when there is a flu outbreak in European countries. Once in a couple of years, once in 3, 4, 5, 8 years, it gets more serious. And the evidence is that this typically leads to a very short-term decline in the number of births. A longer-term reaction, you could think also of epidemics like the Zika pandemic in Brazil and other parts of Latin America, which had strong negative effect on pregnancies and births, especially, of course, after the authorities warned pregnant women or warned about the dangers for pregnant women to have issues with their fetus. And one can also think of the pandemic as an analogy of disruptions to everyday life, analogical to blackouts and disasters, natural and environmental disasters as well in the past. But there we don't have a very consistent evidence what such a short-term disasters create for fertility, because the evidence goes a little bit both ways, depending on the country, type of disaster, and period you are looking at. Going back to economic shocks, the evidence is quite clear. When there is a large economic crisis, birth rates typically decline across all birth orders, especially for first and second births, as you can see from one of the papers covering the recent Great Recession in Europe and the United States. Now, going back to COVID, so our demographers' expectations, I would argue, were mostly about the likely negative impact of the pandemic, thinking of all this evidence of past economic shocks, disruptions, and health emergencies. But when you follow the media, the picture was less clear-cut. There was a lot of speculation. Will COVID bring baby boom or baby bust? Depending on whether you wanted to follow the story of people being locked at home, having a lot of free time and not knowing what to do, having a lot of intimate life and sex and producing more babies, or whether you wanted to focus more on uncertainties and the stress experienced by many people also during lockdowns and school closures. So this brings me more closely to specific arguments and mechanisms about what we expected, how COVID would affect birth trends and fertility rates. Again, there are more arguments about likely negative impact, negative mechanisms. I mentioned uncertainty. I could also add the fear of infection and of what it means when you get infected during pregnancy, during the pandemic. I should also stress the initial period in high-income countries was a period of huge economic uncertainty. Many people didn't know what will happen with the economy. Will there be massive unemployment? How much income will people lose? What will happen with the jobs? How long the lockdowns will continue? And it took some months before most of the governments in higher income countries started reacting very strongly and started coming up with different schemes to financially support struggling firms, to prop up employment rates, to support people who are working from home or not even working, on furloughs at home. And I think this very massive intervention by many governments actually changed the perspective for many people, because the economy at the end of the day didn't collapse, the labor market didn't collapse, and most countries recovered economically relatively fast from the initial pandemic shock. Of course, the story is often quite different in middle and lower income countries, so here I stress my focus on higher income countries in this presentation. There was also some initial disruption in the provision of assisted reproduction in a number of countries, and I already mentioned some potential positive impact on fertility trends of the pandemic in the early stage, more family time spent together, more time for intimate relations. And on the negative side, also in some countries, the evidence of some disruption in the supply of contraception. But this is more typical of middle income than of higher income countries. We also have an independent evidence from the surveys of fertility intentions done in the early stage of the COVID pandemic. Here I pick up a survey which was done in late April, early May 2020, so 2 months into the pandemic in the United States, where 1/3 of women who claimed they were considering having a baby initially considering having a baby during the year 2020 or in the near future, decided to delay childbearing or to give up childbearing. And a similar evidence came from surveys in other countries on fertility plans and intentions, which were done in the year 2020, so in the early stage of the COVID pandemic. And yet another piece of research suggesting that COVID would bring huge decline in the number of births also came from the research, which was trying to do fertility and pregnancy projections based on fertility and pregnancy related Google searches. The best known research is by Joshua Wild and colleagues on the US data, which based on Google searches predicted a sharp downturn in births by up to 16% in the United States during the first stage of the COVID pandemic, the first about 3 months of the pandemic. So our research essentially follows on some of these expectations. We ask, how did the coronavirus pandemic affect birth and fertility trends? How these trends evolve over time? And what are differences between countries? So very simple questions in a way, and a very simple setup. Let me start with some information about data and methods, because our relatively simple questions might get a little bit more complicated when you think about the data we have at our disposal. So we are working with very, very simple primitive data. We are working with the absolute monthly numbers of births for individual countries or specific regions, because most statistical offices do not publish, even in countries with very good data collection, do not publish monthly data on births by age or other characteristics of the mother. So all we get is the totals, and we need to deal with these very simple numbers to get some insights about what's happening. You see the initial expectations. Initially, we expect that there would be a birth decline during the pandemic, and that it would be stronger in countries which had been initially more affected by the pandemic, especially Southern European countries where the pandemic was first outbreak was very strong in Southern Europe, Italy, Spain, also Belgium and the United Kingdom to a smaller extent. But there were also different perspectives. I remember a presentation by Joshua Goldstein, who also envisioned other scenarios, including the possibility that there would be some ups and downs in birth trends during the pandemic. So this is our database where we put most of our data and results. I know from Christoph it's not really super up to date. We need to update it soon, so you will not find some of the latest data I'm presenting here. We have some monthly numbers of births for about 45 countries and regions, and we are able to estimate monthly total fertility rates for 29 countries. I will tell you in a minute or two how do we do it. We focus on countries with good quality data. This is how we justify our focus on higher income countries. If we were able to get good quality data for Latin America, for instance, we would be covering also countries, middle income countries of Latin America. And you can get data documentation and more information about methodology on the website as well. So you can see here a snapshot of our current data and the time coverage of the current data. For some countries, we go only until the end of the year 2021. For many countries, we have data for the year 2022, or at least for some part of the year 2022. Most of our countries are in Europe, but we also cover some countries in East Asia, such as Taiwan and Japan and South Korea. We also cover Singapore. We also cover New Zealand, and from the US and Canada, and from Latin America, we have data for Chile until the end of 2021. Even such simple data as absolute numbers of births are not so easy to interpret for all cases, because there are still data issues even for those. Sometimes these data are reported by months of registration rather than the months of birth, and that could distort our analyses. Sometimes some countries present or publish preliminary data, which are later updated and declared to be final data. Some countries have some fluctuations in their data, either because of small sample size, small numbers of monthly births, or also because the data may be collected by months of registration and the registration could be disrupted for several reasons, including pandemic-related reasons such as lockdown or slowdown in data processing during lockdowns. There is clear impact on seasonality. Births is a seasonal phenomenon, so we need to deal with the fact that even if fertility rates are stable, births differ a lot from one month to the next. And one important thing I have to say, when we look at birth trends, we have to take, of course, into account duration of pregnancy. So if you think about COVID typically hitting European countries or highly developed countries since early March 2020, when also the lockdowns and social distancing measures started being enforced. If one takes into account that the average duration of pregnancy is 8.7 months from ovulation to delivery, we would expect first impact of the COVID on birth trends since births occurring in November 2020 and even more so in December 2020. Unless you expect that some women would have an abortion, which would kind of speed up the impact of the pandemic, but we are not expecting that. And I didn't see any consistent evidence that abortion rates or induced abortion rates would increase. We are using several main ways how to analyze our data. One is very simple. We look at the relative change in the number of births in percent compared with the same months in the pre-pandemic period. Why the same months? To take crude control over the seasonality of births, and also months have the same numbers of days, so it's an easy way also how to control for different lengths of calendar months. Why the pre-pandemic period? Because once we start relating any trends since the start of the COVID to any period during COVID, this kind of measure would be disrupted by whatever happened, by the ups and downs during the COVID. But this measure, of course, has some disadvantage as well, because once we move into the second year or the third year of the pandemic and after pandemic times, we are still relating our births to pre-pandemic period, increasing the intervals with which we look at the data. So for the first year, we look at the previous year. In the second year of the COVID, we compare the data with the period 2 years ago, and so on. So one has to keep this in mind when looking at these relative trends. Then for a smaller set of countries, we estimate total fertility rates. One can say this is a more precise measure. And we do one more thing. We also do ARIMA-based projections of what would be the expected number of births if the birth trends of the pre-COVID period until October 2020 in terms of births, not conceptions, so conceptions until January, February 2020, if the trends until the time would continue. So we model the expected numbers of births during the years 2020, 2021, and early 2023. And then we compare this expected number of births with 95% projection intervals with the observed one to see whether the COVID trends and post-COVID trends were statistically significantly different from the projected ones. And the same for the TFRs. We have to do some tricks to estimate total fertility rates. For the sake of keeping time relatively short, I'm not going to discuss it now, but again, keep in mind that our estimates of monthly TFRs are based as a starting point on the absolute numbers of births, and then some adjustments, how we turn this absolute number of births into TFR estimates. So we are not perfectly correct. We treat it as a crude way of estimating monthly TFRs. And we also adjust the monthly numbers of births for the impact of seasonality and calendar effect. So the number of days in a month, and also number of different weekdays in a month, because birth trends also differ by weekdays. And so if you compare the crude observed numbers by months, as you can see for Spain and Germany here, These are the very light gray lines which are coming up and down in the background. And then the adjusted data, which you see here as the dark, thick black line, you see how the adjustment changes the picture. Nevertheless, even after the adjustment, if you look at Spain, the picture is very clear. Here you have the start of the coronavirus pandemic, plus about 8 months, and the birth trends crash for a few months, just for a few months. That was it. So clearly, COVID in Spain was the biggest disruption to a long-term series of declining numbers of births, because suddenly you have a short-term crash and then a recovery, more or less, than following the previous trend. But this picture was not the same for each and every country. Look at Germany in the next picture. You do not see any big impact of the initial period of any big crash at the start of the COVID. You see some ups and downs, more or less a recovery or increase of births in a later stage of the COVID pandemic. And then you see a huge slump in the early 2022, which is well after the start of the COVID. And I will discuss this trend, which happened in more countries than just Germany, at the end of my presentation. So let's look now at more countries, how their birth trends changed during the pandemic. So this is a picture for 6 selected countries, Portugal, Spain, Russia, Finland, Germany, Israel, and the United States, of how the relative numbers of births evolved during the pandemic. What you often see typically at the start, like you saw for Spain, the number of births go down sharply in the first few months of the pandemic, which means in terms of the number of births around December 2020, January 2021. But this decline doesn't happen uniformly in each and every country. In Finland, there is no decline. In Germany, there is no decline. In Israel, there is small decline at the start. So this didn't happen everywhere. Interestingly, after a few months, births in a number of countries go up. You see it less in Spain. It's around 0 in March 2021. But if you look at Finland, if you look at Germany, you look at Israel, and also for 1 month in Russia, if you take 8 to 9 months back, these are conceptions around June, July 2020, when the first wave was over. And I would say that many people started expecting that was it. COVID is over. We can go back to our normal lives. And of course, COVID was not over. And what happened after March 2021 depended also partly on how countries responded. So I would argue that countries which provided better environment for having children, like generous family support, generous family policies, or economic support also to people who were on home leave or who were not able to keep their full jobs, these countries typically had some increase in the number of births relative to the pre-COVID period. This happened in Israel. This happened in Germany. This happened even more so very strongly in Finland. And then we also have countries which just go somehow back to where they were before COVID. No big change during 2021. That's Spain, that's Japan. There's some fluctuations, that's Russia. And we also have some examples of countries where fertility trends, birth trends continued going down during the year 2021, but not with such intensity as in the first months. And then comes another story, which I will comment later on. 2022, birth trends start declining again strongly in many countries. You can see it even in Finland, where there was a small baby boom in 2021. You can see a very clear change in trends in Germany. You can see also a sharp change in trends in Japan and in Russia. So we get back to that, I would say, quite unexpected trend in 2022 later on. Now I also show Chile. For Chile, we have data only for 2021, but Chile is like Portugal. Things were going really down in the first months of the pandemic, but then they didn't recover very strongly. The decline was easing out and was becoming smaller during the year 2021, but still there was a significant continuing decline in the number of births during the first year of the pandemic. I skip this picture, it's too complicated, but when we summarize the trends in relative births across many countries, we have 36 countries here, you still clearly see the three different trend changes during the pandemic: the decline in the first 3 months, the short-term recovery around March 2021, and then a decline in 2022 in many countries. And in between, we have different country-specific trends, but you can see the blue line is typically around zero or even slightly above zero, which is higher than was the relative trend in the number of births before the pandemic. So one can say that in many countries, the middle period of the pandemic during the first year and start of the second year brought some slight improvement of birth trends related to the expectation. This can be also shown in our EMA model. So when we compare the observed trends with the forecasted trends, in a case of Spain, we see that the most significant thing was the initial decline. And after a few months, the observed trends were exactly in line with what the ARIMA-based forecasts were suggesting, sometimes a little bit above, but not above the confidence interval. A different picture for Germany. For most of the time, birth trends were perfectly aligned with the projection until January 2022, when births declined well below the projected numbers. A different picture in the United States, actually, where the number of births during most of the pandemic, but even post-pandemic period, was higher than expected from the ARIMA model. So again, a lot of country heterogeneity. And when we summarize this picture across different countries, you can see countries where trends were higher than expected by the model, by the ARIMA model. That's the countries and months colored in green here, such as Finland, Netherlands, Israel. We also have Norway there. And then we have countries where trends during most of the pandemic didn't really change very strongly from the expectations, but which saw a huge decline in the number of births. That's the kind of purple violet color here. When you see asterisks, the decline is significant compared to the prediction. You see significant declines in most countries in the first months of the pandemic. We commented on that. And then we see some countries where trends are not as prominent into 21 to 22 as compared to the projections as in the first sets of countries. So again, a lot of country heterogeneity, but some trends, ups and downs, quite similar across countries, even when one compares with the projections. Here you can see examples of differences in total fertility rates across countries, which more or less mirror some of the evidence I was showing with the relative birth trends. So that's just an illustration that actually the TFRs show a similar picture, often an initial decline. In some countries, then some pandemic recovery, like in the US. In some countries, you can see relatively strong fertility decline at the start of the 2022, which was stronger than the start of the COVID, for instance, in Hungary here. But again, countries differ a lot. So I don't want to walk you through all this picture for different countries. Let me just show you the Nordic countries where total fertility rates actually went up for the year 2022. So in the first year of the pandemic, contrasting, for instance, with Southern European countries, sorry, I have to go down, where fertility rates, I don't have Southern Europe here, sorry, here we go, where fertility rates dropped very strongly in the first stage of the pandemic, and then in Italy and Spain actually went back to where they were before the pandemic and didn't even shift much in the year 2022. Whereas in Germany, for instance, you can see a huge drop, largest drop at the start of the year 2022. So again, to summarize trends in total fertility rates, one can look at a picture of the average across the European Union countries. We have 17 countries with available data here out of 27. In a few months, TFRs went down. The first months in the pandemic, in several months later, they recovered, and you see the jump is quite big. it's by about 0.14 from the trough to the peak just in 3 months. And then there are some ups and downs, but even somewhat higher levels than before the pandemic in the year 2021. And then the kind of mysterious decline in fertility rates in 2022. So let me conclude my presentation by some discussions on the puzzle of fertility decline in 2022, which I would argue was largely unexpected. So we are back to the graph of predicted and observed numbers of births using ARIMA model. We have another example here. We have Czechia, where birth trends more or less followed the projected levels most of the pandemic, and then comes the year 2022, and they start being significantly lower than the projection. And when I say significantly lower, you can also take into account that the projection gets more uncertain the more we move to the future. So the projected intervals are widening. So you really need to have a stronger move in the observed number of births to achieve significant increase of decline. I already commented on this picture. So we are looking especially at the change in the violet colors here in many countries in the year 2022. Thinking of total fertility rates, these are two illustrations how the TFRs, how the estimated TFRs dropped between late 2021 and start of 2022. Sometimes you see the drop really from 1 month to the next in the order of magnitude of 0.14, 0.16 in these two countries, Czechia and Germany. So the magnitude is bigger than the previous fluctuations of births during the COVID. So what could be behind this? Is it return to pre-pandemic trends after restrictions and lockdowns ended? Is it some compensatory drop in birth rates in countries where fertility was somewhat higher during the pandemic? Is it that people returned again to their busy lives and work life and stopped thinking about having kids when being busy with all other things again? Is it the impact of vaccination? Or is it new economic pressures, which we can see now after the start of the Russian war against Ukraine, high inflation and more economic uncertainty in the recent year? Or is it something to do with persistent disruptions to partnerships and families during COVID? And we are now starting a more sophisticated analysis of that. But to give you a very broad picture, I show you correlations of several indicators for different countries. So here you have selection about 15 countries from Finland to Japan. And we just show a selection of different indicators, how they were correlated with monthly ups and downs in adjusted total fertility rates in the last couple of years. Unemployment rate, curiously enough, during the COVID period was often positively linked to fertility. Consumer confidence was often showing a negative influence. Inflation, this is what you wouldn't expect as well, was often showing, this is what you would expect, was often showing a negative impact. But I think the strongest evidence and the strongest indicator here is the provision of the first dose of vaccination. In almost each and every country, with the big exception of Portugal, the start of the vaccination campaign was associated with a very strong, clear drop in fertility rates, often significant, for some countries, non-significant. And these are just correlations. So take into account, this is not a sophisticated model. The model may show something different, but we are now looking at it. And when we model it, the first dose still shows up as the most significant indicator affecting fertility trends and pushing fertility low in 2022, not in every country, in most of them. But the second dose leads to fertility recovery to a large extent. So our model suggests that women were avoiding pregnancies, or some women were avoiding pregnancies during the time when they were getting vaccinated. Also, maybe following some very early suggestions and warnings from health authorities when it was still unclear what the impact of vaccines on pregnant women may be and their babies. And then they stopped avoiding pregnancies after they got their second dose. So then it was some other things which were affecting their behavior. And you can see also here one more thing: stringency is the index showing how strongly countries were imposing lockdowns and other limitations, is positively related to birth trends. So in many countries, lockdowns and all these measures were positively correlated with fertility. And when they ended, which was also around the time when vaccination was in the full swing, of course, fertility, this has negatively affected fertility. So it's not only the story of vaccination, it's also partly the story of the end of restrictions and people getting back to their busy lives. And as a last analytical slides, just as a foretaste of what is happening after COVID, these are the relative birth trends in Czechia. We already looked at them from different angles, but here they include also the first 3 months of this year and compared to the pre-COVID period. And I would say this is by far the sharpest change, the sharpest decrease in fertility rates and birth trends we observe. And we are now looking at the period associated with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the high inflation and economic uncertainty. So we are moving from one crisis or from one shock to another types of shock, something which will be also very exciting and interesting to analyze in the coming months, how the economic uncertainty is impacting fertility trends. So here is the summary. I would say that 2020 to 2022 was a very volatile period in birth trends with a lot of instability and fluctuations. And I think the story is the same in middle-income countries like Brazil. I think our research clearly shows how important in such unstable periods is to study short-term trends, because annual data wouldn't tell us a lot of stories we are observing in these short-term trends. Annual data just sort of average a lot of these ups and downs. We saw a lot of diversity across countries, but some of the broad shifts, ups and downs, were taking place simultaneously across most countries. So some of these roller coaster trends were shared across the countries, like the initial pandemic decline, then a brief recovery, and also the 2022 fertility decline was shared in most countries. So the recent fertility drops were associated with vaccination to some extent, and the very latest trend, which we don't analyze here, probably has to do with the economic uncertainty unfolding in the recent period. There were uneven responses during vaccination, which is just another piece of evidence suggesting it's not vaccine per se causing some sort of infertility or temporary infertility, because we have countries where vaccination doesn't show any impact, like the United States, or where it shows very little impact, like Portugal. Well, no impact in Portugal, or even positive one, or almost no impact, like Israel. Okay, that's my presentation. Thank you very much for following, and I will be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas, for the very nice presentation. You brought so many stuff to discuss. We have a chat here on the YouTube. I encourage everyone to send some questions. I do have some questions to start if nobody sent anything. And one thing that we already discussed something on those lines informally, but I want to hear from you. It's about you are talking about the whole countries, but you're not breaking down to according to socioeconomic characteristics. And this is something that we are doing, or have been doing in Latin America with some colleagues. We just doing some relative differences like you did, and comparing according to educational groups. And what we saw, for instance, in Brazil is a good example. We saw that young women age below 24 years old, low educated, they actually, during the pandemic, we saw that they speed up the decline in terms of birth counts. But when we look at women at age above 35 and highly educated, something different happen. So they kind of anticipate the pregnancies during the pandemic. So we see something like you showing in some graphs, an increasing in terms of number of births, specifically among those group of women highly educated above certain age, 35 plus. So my question is if there is some similar pattern, if you guys are exploring something in those lines, if you have data to explore something specifically according to socioeconomic characteristics of mothers. So this is one thing that I was having in mind. Another thing, it's about birth order. Uh, have you guys advanced in somehow in analysis about birth order, how this change during the pandemic, if there is a changing actually in terms of preferences of number of births, how the pandemic has affected that. So I will start with these two questions and then I will open to my colleagues here at YouTube. And if there is no other questions, I'll come with a second round of questions, okay? So go ahead, please.
Perfect. Yes, thank you, Everton. These are super relevant questions. We were planning to do much more analysis in this direction, and then we got stuck with a lot of stuff around our monthly data. So we are not analyzing as much as we would like to. But if I summarize some of the research we did, some of the data we have on the Human Fertility Database, but also some of the research which was coming up about European countries and the US, I can essentially confirm many of your observations which you have about Brazil. It was especially the higher educated women in their late 20s and 30s who were having a small baby boom during the COVID period. And if you go to parity, these were most typically women already having a child. So I would say that especially the better educated, obviously with better income, had more favorable economic and work conditions during the pandemic. They were not afraid about losing their jobs, but they also have larger flats, larger houses, so they are better able to handle the fact that their kids may not be going to school. They are better able to handle work from home. And some of these parents, some of these couples just, I would say, took advantage of not many things in terms of social life and mobility happening during COVID. And they had a second kid during that period of time. It would be like the stereotypical family having another kid during the COVID. And we see the same thing that low income women, lower educated women, and younger women, they continue having fertility declines, often childless as well, didn't participate in any baby boom. One can also think that COVID was a huge disruptive force for couple formation. So if some people didn't live together during COVID, especially if some of them had to follow some social distancing rules, it was difficult to live together. It was difficult to date. It was difficult to find a new partner or to move in with the existing one, at least for some months when there were stricter measures enforced. Of course, this became different later on. So definitely there is a huge diversity in socioeconomic response to the pandemic. I think especially the better educated high-income people had relatively good lives, but then we have different also responses by country. If some countries provided better support even for lower income people, and that could be translated, of course, to different reactions.
Okay, thank you so much. There's a question here from Jose Costa. It's a former student of us. And he asked about the indirect effects of migration on the observed fertility trends post 2020. If that's possible somehow to observe that with the available the data that you showed us, if there's some way how to measure the impact of and there's another question which I also, let's see, yeah. Victor Manuel Guerrero Garcia, it's also a good friend of us. He's asking about heterogeneity in fertility trends, also about migrants and native population in each country. How actually uh, uh, pandemic disrupt or somehow change the terms of fertility among those two groups, migrants and native population. So I'll take these two, and then I'll come back with another questions from the audience. Okay.
Yes, thanks. So, as far as migration is concerned, uh, at the start of the pandemic, when we started working on these trends, we were a little bit afraid about two possible impacts. One thing is that immigration to rich immigration countries, think of Sweden, the Netherlands, Germany, temporarily slowed down a lot during 2020 because people were not allowed to travel, it was difficult to move. And the second worry we had was that there was some return move of migrants from some rich countries, especially from the UK after Brexit, but also from some other countries back to some southern Eastern European countries, which are poorer and where people maybe decided to go back home during the COVID because they didn't have proper job in Sweden or in the UK. But at the end of the day, it turned out these migration movements were not strong enough, and definitely not strong enough to cause, for instance, the number of births increasing significantly in southeastern Eastern Europe, where you would expect these migrants to, to come back. And for most countries, we also saw at the end of the day that migration went more or less back to its initial levels already in the second half of 2020 or in the year 2021. So by the year 2021, in many countries, the numbers of immigrants was again quite similar to the year 2019. So the disruption in 2020 was relatively short term to really influence population structures by age and to have a strong impact on the observed numbers of births. Maybe not in each and every country, but I would expect that there would be a stronger impact of migration if we were studying subnational trends. Because, for instance, in the US, there's some evidence that people moved from regions and states with stricter lockdowns, think of California, to regions with more easygoing regimes, think of Texas or Florida. So if a lot of people move from California, of course, numbers of births in California drop more during the years 2020, 2021. As far as the rates of fertility or birth trends among migrants are concerned, I confess I didn't study it consistently, but I think that if you think about the socioeconomic gradient, which we discussed before, that migrants typically had a bigger decline in the number of births during the COVID pandemic compared to the native women. And if there was a baby boom, then it was mostly driven by the native women who were having more babies rather than migrants. So as a result, I would expect, but again, I didn't look at it properly, that the gap in fertility rates between higher fertility migrants, somewhat lower fertility rates, native women, was probably narrowing during the pandemic. But it's a great research topic. We need to look at it a little bit more.
Sure. I'm waiting for more questions from our audience, but I do have some more stuff to bring to. One thing is about the baseline time that you used for the study of the variations. So you took like November 2019 until October 2020, and you take variations as a monthly difference. And I was thinking about that. What's the best baseline time to do that? Of course, we need to separate two effects here. What was the common current trend before the pandemic and what happened during the pandemic? So this is something that what criticism do you have about this measure? Do you think it's the best way to do it when you have only birth counts, you don't have the denominators for the analysis, or we could do something else like you did ARIMA models, just forecast some trends, and so that was one thing that I was thinking: how can we improve measurements during these times of this disrupted by pandemic of some socioeconomic thing. Another thing is about the unexpected correlation with unemployment that you showed us. Do you have some thoughts about it? How can you explain that?
Yes, so thanks for that. Let me see how I respond. So the baseline that's a very interesting question. If you look at how people analyze mortality trends, for instance, excess death, excess mortality rate, sometimes they take much longer baseline than one calendar year. But that's easier to be done in mortality analyses where things are not shifting rapidly over time. In fertility rates, in fertility analysis, we have countries where the number of births drops by 10% every year. South Korea had a big drop in birth rates every year after year after year. In 2015 to 2020, the declines were sometimes by 8-10% in a year. If you take a baseline of 4 years or 3 years, you would start with a drop by 30% in the first year, and it wouldn't be analyzing what happened during the COVID. So for the initial period, we really try to start as close to the start of the COVID, just the same months a year ago, and see how trends shifted around the start of the COVID pandemic. If until September, October 2020, the annual birth trends were going down, we see it, and then we look how it evolves 1 month after another in the next months. Of course, as we move farther through the pandemic, this crude way of measuring birth trends is getting worse and weaker because we jump from 1 year to 2 years intervals. Then we think, okay, should we standardize it and divide by 2 to have an annual fertility or annual change in the number of births? It's not easy. That's why we also started doing the TFRs, adjusted for seasonality and calendar. I think the trends in the total fertility rates become a little bit more better way and more reliable way to follow what's going on when we can estimate them, but we cannot do it for all countries. And then the ARIMA model, I think, is even better, but again has some limitations as well. Because as I mentioned, when you look at the perspective of more than 1 or 2 years, the predicted intervals are widening. And okay, I showed this case of Czechia, which still has 11 million people. But when you take a small country like Estonia with 1.5 million people, the intervals are widening to the crazy extent that you don't get any significant change after 1 or 2 years. So even ARIMA models have some limitations. We were thinking for the case of the vaccination period, should we run ARIMA models starting later than before the pandemic? But when we estimate ARIMA model, which starts not in October 2020, but maybe in October 2021, the model picks up trends which are affected by COVID, which we didn't want to, and predicts what's happening in 2022, 23 based on partly affected by the COVID trends. So we are back to the pre-pandemic period, and we don't have a good solution for that. But we think that when we look at different measures, and then when we start doing more sophisticated fixed effects analyses, which we are now moving into now, that we really get robust estimates of what kind of indicators and what kind of factors were affecting birth shifts during the COVID and after the COVID period.
The employment question.
Yes. Unemployment. That's a curious one. We don't have a clear answer. And of course we try to control for multicollinearity. So we were also checking, for instance, whether inflation is not somehow picking up unemployment. But our main response is that during the COVID period, unemployment is not measuring the usual uncertainty, which it does in the usual periods of economic downturn. Partly because the main shifts in unemployment happen in the first months of the COVID pandemic, and then unemployment often went down to the normal level. So it was a very short-term shift. Like in the US, you had a huge increase in unemployment for several months, and then it went down almost to the pre-COVID levels. So it was a specific period, first wave, when the uncertainty is picked up by other indicators than unemployment, probably. And on the top of that, again, we get back to government intervention. So being unemployed, for instance, in Europe, in the year 2020 or 2021 often had different connotations than getting unemployed during the economic recession of 2008, 2010, because many people were able to get consistent support by the government if they lost their jobs or if they were furloughed. Um, Maybe the last thing is that actually unemployment in most countries, because of the government interventions and tight labor market, except the US and few other countries, unemployment was remaining consistently low during the pandemic. So we are thinking of shifts in unemployment, not to crazy high levels like 15, 20% in many countries. Unemployment was low, sometimes even super low during much of the pandemic.
Thanks. There are some questions from the audience here. So one, I also had something in mind. It's a colleague of us, Roberto do Carmo. He asked about if there's possible to identify some kind of pattern of changes in fertility, considering the how big is the country among the different countries that you showed us. I also have something to complete with the same question. If there is any pattern of policies that the countries took which affected the behavior of women, and as we see, the birth counts changed. Another thing that he asked is about the temporary impacts of the pandemic, how that could implicate on changings in terms of patterns of fertility, probably in the future. That's what he mentioned. And Wanda Cabela, it's a colleague from Uruguay. She wants to that if you could elaborate something more about the possible channels that links the vaccination and how the women respond to that, how they were reluctant to get pregnant during this process of vaccination. So there's a couple of questions. I'll leave it to you again.
Right. So thinking if we see a consistent pattern which would be related to how big the country is, I think that was the first question. My answer is no. I don't see any clear impact of whether the country is big like the US or Russia, or whether it's small like Israel or Slovenia. Besides, perhaps small countries have more instability. I think that's a normal thing in fertility research. If you have a small country, there are more ups and downs in fertility and birth trends, partly because of small numbers of births, but partly because small countries like analyzing a small region. If you would slice down the US into small regions, you better pick up also specific things which happened in that one region, a stronger wave of the pandemic or stronger economic decline increase than in the whole country. The whole country, if it's big like Russia or US, somehow averages a lot of smaller things happening on a smaller scale. But besides that, I think much more consistent picture is when we look at broader regions, and this relates to your question on policies. So we see that, for instance, Nordic countries had a kind of baby boom when we averaged the year 2021. We see also quite positive response in the number of births in German-speaking countries, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and also the neighboring Czechia to a small extent. We see similar story in Belgium, France, and the Netherlands. So when we summarize this together, what I named now, plus the US, but US is a specific case, but the countries I mentioned in Europe are countries with relatively generous family policies, with relatively strong government interventions and strong welfare states. So essentially, the economic uncertainty was definitely reduced by the existence of welfare state and government policies in these countries where fertility rates were typically going up. And also people who were in more disadvantageous position. still could count on all kinds of government supports and interventions. And on the other scale, you have countries where birth trends were most negative also during the whole year 2021. I could name Chile, I could name Portugal in Europe, I could name some Southeastern European countries and Central Eastern European countries such as Poland. And if you simplify the picture, these are countries with weaker welfare state, less government interventions, lower economic development, so somewhat poorer than the first group of countries, and also countries where people have less trust in government, except for Portugal. So I don't want to pick up just one of these things, but I think there is some relatively consistent evidence that stronger welfare state countries, countries with stronger family policies and stronger trust in the governments are those where the fertility responses were more positive. US is the main exception here. I think there were really strong interventions with the government even providing some cash some extra cash to the people, which actually temporarily lowered the poverty rate in the US to very low levels for some periods of time, lower than usual, which probably again turned the US a little bit more towards a welfare state like country and make conditions for some people more advantageous for having babies than elsewhere. And then there was a question on what channels explain the link between vaccination and birth trends in 2022. So we looked at different measures because we were really trying to get a little bit closer to the heart of this. And we looked at the impact of the start of the vaccination campaign. We looked at the trajectory of birth decline as the number of people getting the first dose was increasing. We also plugged in the impact of the second dose of vaccination. What came out quite clearly out of all these different efforts we were doing is that fertility decline was faster than you would expect based on vaccination. So if you would think that it's vaccine causing people not having babies, we would observe birth decline by 1, 2, or 3 months later than we were actually observing it. At the time when the elderly were getting vaccinated and not the middle-aged or not the people in reproductive ages, we already saw births going down. And that was a clear signal for us that it was a kind of conscious postponement of pregnancies. And then we went down to the discussions in November 2020, December 2020, January 2021 among health authorities, when some countries and governments and health authorities were giving preliminary assessment and advice for the people, which was saying essentially, yes, get vaccinated. That's the best thing you can do during COVID. But we still don't have a consistent evidence whether there might be some negative impacts on pregnant women. And so if you plan a pregnancy, you may try to avoid pregnancy during vaccination. And this message has changed very quickly. In March 2021, so before people of reproductive age were really able to get vaccinated, the typical advice of these advisory bodies was, vaccine is safe. You don't need to be afraid to be pregnant and get a vaccine. Because by that time, Israel, which was the first country vaccinating most of its population, already had a lot of data and research into it. But once you have a message out, it doesn't go away. So the initial message, which some of the governments or health bodies were giving in December 2020 or November 2020, which was the message of caution, it just stick in people's minds. It was there on social media. It was still debated in the newspapers and in the media when the official message was already changed. And I think this was part of the decision making that some people decided to be cautious and not to risk any adverse effect and decided not to get pregnant.
Okay, but just to complement something, you said something about the Nord countries that you saw an increase in, but Sweden is a different question, isn't it? Because just came up a paper published in Demographer research about how the couples respond to how the fertility rates of the fertility it's going in more recent years. And it seems that actually the pandemic just push the fertility in Sweden. I'm not speaking about Finland, though, for it went more down than was about how they treat the, because they are all also consider a country which has a policy family oriented and gender equity and all these kind of things which push fertility up, but we didn't see that. And do you have some thoughts about it? What can you say about Sweden case, which is different, I
Yes.
think?
Can I open my presentation again? I hope
Go
I don't
ahead.
lose.
Go ahead.
I hope I don't lose too much time with that.
No, it's not. Go ahead.
It takes a short while, so I allow. Let me get the right slide. We get the fertility rate of Nordic countries. Here we go. So I hope you can see the picture. This is the picture of.
Oh, it's all black.
Okay.
Now
So,
now it's great. Now it's going. Now it's good.
but you don't see the full screen,
Now we
right?
do. We
It
do.
doesn't
No, that doesn't matter. We do
doesn't
see
matter.
it. Yeah, we see
So
it.
I'm going back to the Nordic countries. So what you see here is a comparison of trends in total fertility rates in each of these Nordic countries compared to the average across all countries. So if you start with Denmark, it goes up more or less for 1 year and then it declines. Finland, it goes up even sharper and then it declines. For Norway, it goes up and we don't see the decline yet, but I can tell you as a spoiler that it declines as much as in Finland. In Sweden, Sweden is somewhat different because you don't see such a clear upturn. But still, if you follow the trends in 2020 and the trends in 2021, you can see either a stabilization or a slight, maybe slight increase compared to what you would expect. And then things go down as everywhere else. So it really boils down to which period you are looking at. If you look at the year 2021, fertility rates in Sweden didn't really decline over the year. They were more or less stable or even slightly increased in some of the months. But if we include the year 2022 into the analysis of the pandemic impact, then in Sweden, as much as in Denmark, Finland, and Norway, which is not shown here yet, fertility goes down sharply since about the start of the vaccination campaign. So Sweden doesn't have such a clear increase in fertility rates, but I would say that throughout the most of the COVID period, when COVID was really having strongest impact, it didn't have any clear decline either. And then comes the decline in a later stage. So
Oh, interesting.
how to explain the way that Sweden is somewhat different? I don't have a clear explanation. That's something the guys looking at Nordic countries with their register-based data and
Yeah.
all the variables they can put in. I'm sure Gunnar or somebody through their
Yeah.
or some others will have research.
Well, we are coming to the end. I don't see many other questions in the chat. And so if there's no further questions, I just want to once more thank you so much for take the time, present your research, which is incredible, and enlighten us with many nice stuff about high income countries, which we keep, for sure we can use and transfer to middle income and low income countries. So thank you again, Thomas. I hope you some day to come here to visit us, and thank you so much. Thank you the audience for being this 1 hour and a half almost present for the good questions. And if there is no anything else, I just finish here with a seminar.
Thank you very much, and it was a pleasure to be here with you, at least virtually.
So thank you, guys. See you.
Yeah. See you.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.